any commander has to make a choice between balancing two desirable things, economic efficiency and expediency versus protection. Crudely speaking, when you have a tank formation, you can drive it in a column. That is the one that optimizes economic expediency and fuel efficiency, but it's dangerous because if you get caught with your pants down by the adversary, you're lined up and easy to be destroyed. The way that you would actually try to maximize protection would be you flare out, you go into line formation, you're dispersed, you move slower, but if you get engaged, you're prepared to handle that threat. Right now, this huge territory in the Russian Federation bordering Ukraine is optimized for economic efficiency. And my argument is that if the Biden administration follows suit, like many European states have now done, and remove all restrictions on what the Ukrainians are allowed to target in Russia, then it will force upon the Russian command to make difficult decisions about to what extent do they reconfigure their rear and support areas in order to maximize protection, or at least improve protection in exchange for supporting at the expense of efficiency. Concretely, that'll have very important effects for Ukraine. Big ammunition depots will be partitioned and more sliced into a series of dispersed and small ammunition depots. Same for fuel. You won't be able to have big accumulations of your forces as far as deep. You'll have to stretch your interior lines further. And what we've seen is that the Russians perform a lot better when they have short interior lines versus long interior lines. It's also critical for the air operations that the Ukrainians are planning and the air capabilities are trying to build. Russia has limited air defense and electronic warfare protection assets. And right now, the Russian command enjoys the luxury of being able to exclusively have to worry about protecting the frontmost areas of the theater in Ukraine. And they can really pile on all of their air defense assets in a very relatively geographically small area, as opposed to having to consider the need to deploy those inwards, rearray the way that they have these limited assets deployed to protect important and vulnerable targets in the rear. And if we can actually get the Russians to redeploy some of those air defense assets instead of being at the front to the rear, then that, of course, will make a better operating environment for the various different Western aircraft that are going to be going into Ukraine soon.
You mentioned a moment ago the air operations that Ukraine is planning. As part of the defensive operations in the north of Ukraine, Ukraine has launched an airstrike using a Ukrainian Air Force jet for the first time against what's been called a Russian command node in Belgorod. How significant do you think that attack is?
Yeah, we're working on trying to see what kind of battle damage assessment we can clarify from the extent of that attack. But in general, I think it's very important. I think it's extremely important that we revisit collectively our assumptions about air power in this war. For the first 2.5 years of this war, really, air power has been sort of a secondary or tertiary afterthought when it comes to war. And a large part of that is because I think it actually stems from the sanctuary, right? We've assumed that the Ukrainians are not going to be capable of using air power the way NATO would use air power because the Russians have a very capable air force and they have a lot of air defense systems on the ground that we're not able to take out. And if we start to examine some of those assumptions, right, like why can't we take out the air defense systems? Well, it's because they're based on Russian territory. And we can't strike Russian territory. Well, if we check that assumption, it no longer is axiomatically impossible that using Scalp and Storm Shadows and ATACMS missiles, the Ukrainians could conduct a shaping operation that seeks to destroy Russian air defense systems, S-300s and S-400s, try to get the Russians to redeploy some of those from the front towards the rear to protect them. And then it's no longer sort of a crazy thought to say the Ukrainians can start building towards, over the course of many months and years, a concept of operations where you actually do have Ukrainian aircraft operating in the theater, conducting strikes, doing air-to-air operations, and supporting combined arms. I think this Ukrainian strike, if it's confirmed against the bunker node in Belgorod, that's going to be very important, and I hope it'll be the first heralding event for what will be a renewed series of Ukrainian operations in the air domain. Since the Russians began their Kharkiv offensive in on May 10th, the Russians have made very small tactical gains. You can go measure it on the map, but they've only penetrated, such and thus kilometers, not very far. They've lost a lot of forces, and they've been held up and pinned down in Vovchansk for a while. They've yet to seize the entire city, and Ukrainian forces have been conducting a series of tactical counterattacks to try to improve their tactical positions within the city. The Russians, nonetheless, they still maintain significant operational reserves for this operation. By our estimates, they've only committed about a third, maybe a little bit more of their prepared force for this operation. And the Russians absolutely maintain the opportunity to be able to intensify their operations. I'd note that, over the last 24 hours, the leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, just announced as of yesterday, June 9th, that some of his Chechen forces actually crossed the border from Kursk into Sumy Oblast, and they claim that they seized a border village. We need to verify those claims, but I would just add that it would be completely consistent with the Russian campaign design, which is the Russians seek to open up a series of fronts, put military pressure on the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians then stretch themselves too thin across this whole theater of operations in order to generate opportunities and facilitate what could be some Russian breakthroughs in what we think is the priority area, eastern Ukraine.
And those developments that you've just described since the US aid package, have they been smaller tactical gains on Russia's behalf than you might have expected, or greater, or indeed exactly what you would have predicted?
Yeah, so I think the tactical gains around Avdiivka that especially occurred in April were concerning because it seemed like the Russians were able to actually exploit the fact that the Ukrainians there were underprepared, under-equipped, and they managed to project west of Avdiivka at a rate that surprised me, faster than what I would have expected. But recently it's bogged down as the Russians have actually approached the main area where the Ukrainians have built their main line of defense just west of Avdiivka. So it was fast at first, but then it slowed down in a surprising way. With regards to the Kharkiv operation, that was very interesting. We were forecasting the Russians to actually start their Kharkiv operation much later than they actually did. The time window we were thinking that they would begin it would be late May or early June. They began it in early May on May 10, and also under strength. All the indicators suggested that the Russians wanted to create an operational grouping of about 50 to 100,000 forces, personnel for that operation, and they committed to it significantly under strength of that target, somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 50,000, so about half. And I think the timing and the seeming decision for the Russians to go after this offensive, despite not yet being fully prepared to their desired strength, is indicative of the Russians indeed wanted to seize the opportunity before the aid began to surge to the front. I think they expedited the timetables to try to make sure that they could get whatever they could, create whatever effects they're trying to create on the ground before the Ukrainians would be able to rebuff them. And there's a risk there, right? You take advantage of that opportunity when the aid situation and the material situation is worse for the Ukrainians, but you also take a risk in that your own strength isn't there. And that so far, it seems that gamble has not paid off for the Russians. There's a massive bottleneck right now in terms of available airframes, but more importantly, pilots and training pilots. The U.S. is not able to rapidly train Ukrainian pilots for a variety of reasons. And so the faster that we can get more airframes in Ukraine up and running, the better. Standardization would be ideal. However, at the end of the day, the approach to supporting Ukraine has been sort of scrape the barrel, get what we can get, field it, and if we can generate some good effects with it, then proceed with it. Given the organic constraints on training and qualifying F-16 pilots, I think if there's a robust pipeline that we can try to get Ukrainian pilots trained on other airframes, that'll be important as well. I also read some reports that the Mirage jets are apparently going to be capable of firing scalp missiles, which is interesting. So we might potentially see some aircraft being used as part of a cruise missile campaign in order to strike sensitive Russian military assets within Russia, which is an important capability. I'd note that within ATACMS range and some Storm Shadow range. There's a number of Russian military air bases and airfields. And of course, I think what is necessary for the Ukrainians to defend themselves is to crater the runways and destroy a lot of those aircraft before they even get off the ground.
Mhm. And again, you mentioned F-16s there. What stage are we at in terms of progress on those donated F-16s?
Yeah, so a bunch of Ukrainian, well, let me rephrase, a small number of Ukrainian pilots finished their training in Arizona on the F-16, and they're doing some more training in Europe now. All the timelines indicate that the first small batch of Ukrainian pilots, the F-16, should in principle be able to start operating sometime this summer. But I'd iterate that the number of pilots and the number of available airframes is very small at this point. That it's pretty symbolic, and it's not yet what's needed to create, a capable combat unit for example, a regiment or a squadron of a regiment of F-16s. I hope that over the course of several years, months and years, we can build to a larger capability where, again, the Ukrainians can operate pretty conventionally in the air war, but that's predicated on taking away the sanctuary in whole, taking out the air defense assets to make it a safer environment, training more pilots, getting them in there. And, this is, really the sanctuary is a game changer because now we actually can use air power. And there is I think there is a concept of operations where air power can re-enter and potentially be a really disruptive factor for how the Russians assume they would win this war.
Thank you for watching Frontline from Times Radio, the interview series bringing you expert analysis on the world's conflicts, particularly the war in Ukraine. For more, you can listen to Times Radio. You can also go to the Times website, take out a digital subscription, and have access to all the reporting done by our foreign correspondents in Ukraine and indeed elsewhere around the world. And also listen to the Times' World in 10 podcast every day. We take you through the latest developments all in 10 minutes. That's the Times' World in 10 podcast. Thank you very much indeed again for watching Frontline from Times Radio.